The man who walked into Captain Ibrahim Traoré's office on a humid Tuesday morning in Ouagadougou carried credentials that seemed perfect, too perfect. Dr. Michael Harrison introduced himself as a senior UN weapons inspector, sent urgently from New York to investigate reports of illegal arms trafficking through Burkina Faso. His documentation bore all the right stamps. His knowledge of UN protocols was flawless, and his urgent demeanor suggested a crisis that needed immediate presidential attention. But Traoré had known for 6 days that this man was coming. He knew because the real Dr. Michael Harrison was sitting in a safe house in Geneva, unaware that his identity had been stolen. The inspector standing before Traoré was actually Colonel James Mitchell from the CIA's Special Activities Division. And his mission was not to investigate weapons, it was to plant evidence that would justify international intervention in Burkina Faso. What Mitchell didn't know was that every word he was about to speak, every document he would present, every move he would make had already been anticipated, prepared for, and would ultimately expose not just him, but the entire network that had sent him. The preparation for this moment had begun 2 weeks earlier, when Burkina Faso's intelligence service intercepted an encrypted communication between Langley and the US Embassy in Accra. The message was coded, but Traoré's cryptographers, trained by a brilliant mathematician named Dr. Aminata Sawadogo, who had returned from MIT to serve her country, cracked it within hours. The content was explosive. Asset Mitchell approved for Harrison identity. UN documentation package delivered via diplomatic pouch. Operation Sandstorm authorized for execution. Traoré convened his Security Council immediately, but in absolute secrecy. Only 5 people knew about the intercepted message: Traoré himself, his intelligence chief Colonel Paul Kashaw, Dr. Sawadogo, his foreign minister Marie Cabaret, and his personal security commander, Captain Jean-Baptiste Odrago. They met in a secure room beneath the presidential palace, a room swept for bugs every 6 hours and lined with copper mesh to prevent electronic surveillance. They are sending someone posing as a UN inspector, Colonel Kashaw explained, laying out the decoded messages. Based on these communications, he'll claim to be investigating weapons trafficking. But his real mission is to plant evidence of chemical weapons that will justify international intervention. Foreign Minister Caboret had been furious. We should expose this immediately. Call the real UN, the media, everyone. But Traoré had seen a bigger opportunity. No, he said. If we expose it now, they'll just deny everything and try again with a different approach. Let him come. Let him think he's succeeding. We'll give him enough rope to hang not just himself, but everyone involved in this operation. The plan they developed was masterful in its simplicity. They would allow the fake inspector complete access, appearing to cooperate fully while documenting everything. Hidden cameras would record every moment. Their own agents would shadow him invisibly. Most importantly, they would control what he found, without him ever knowing it. Dr. Sawadogo suggested a brilliant addition. We should create false intelligence for him to discover, things that seem incriminating but are actually traceable fabrications. When he reports them, we can prove they are fake and show he planted them. The real Dr. Michael Harrison was located through careful investigation. He was a genuine UN weapons inspector currently on leave in Geneva, completely unaware his identity had been compromised. Burkina Faso's intelligence service monitored him to ensure he remained safe and uninvolved. They even intercepted CIA attempts to create digital footprints suggesting Harrison had traveled to Africa, replacing them with evidence that proved he had remained in Switzerland. The preparation was meticulous. Every room the fake inspector would visit was prepared with hidden cameras so small they were virtually undetectable. Microphones that could pick up whispers from 20 feet away were installed. A special team of intelligence officers was trained to act as government minders, appearing bumbling and inefficient while actually being highly skilled observers. On the morning Mitchell arrived, Traoré watched him from the moment he landed at the airport. The man's confidence was evident in his stride, his practiced authority, in the way he presented his credentials to immigration officials, who had been briefed to act normally. He checked into the city's most luxurious hotel, not knowing his room had been outfitted with surveillance equipment so sophisticated it could read the screen of his laptop from the reflection in his glasses. That first night, Mitchell made a crucial mistake. Believing his hotel room was secure, he used a satellite phone to contact his handler. The conversation, encrypted though it was intercepted and decoded by Dr. Sawadogo's team. "I'm in position," Mitchell reported. "Initial meeting with Traoré tomorrow. The documentation is perfect. He won't suspect anything." "Remember," his handler replied, "you need to find or create evidence of chemical weapons, the Syria playbook." Something that will shock international media and justify immediate action.
Understood, Mitchell said. I've brought the samples. I just need to find the right place to discover them. Tro listened to the recording that night, his anger controlled but evident.
Chemical weapons, he said to Colonel Kishore. They are going to plant evidence of chemical weapons in my country to justify an invasion.
They sent a lie dressed as truth. We exposed the truth hidden in their lie. They thought deception was their weapon. We proved that exposure was stronger.
They came to plant evidence of weapons we didn't have. They left as evidence of crimes they did commit. The fake UN inspector incident entered history not just as an intelligence failure, but as a turning point. It marked the end of an era when powerful nations could fabricate evidence to justify interventions. It began a new era, an era when truth, documented and distributed, could defeat any deception. Mitchell had entered Burkina Faso believing he was writing another chapter in the long history of successful CIA operations. Instead, he wrote the final chapter in the history of evidence-based deception. The fake inspector became real evidence that the age of intelligence impunity was over. The trap Tro had set was perfect because it used the CIA's own methods against them. They valued documentation. He documented their crimes. They relied on deception. He exposed their deceptions. They thought they were clever. He proved he was cleverer. The man who had walked into Tro's office that humid Tuesday morning had believed he was in control. Every word he spoke, every move he made, every document he planted had been anticipated and recorded. The hunter had been hunted from the moment he landed. The deceiver had been deceived before he began. Tro had known all along, and that knowledge, patient, prepared, and perfectly executed, had changed the world. The aftermath of the fake inspector incident continued to reverberate for years, revealing layers of deception far deeper than anyone had initially imagined. Mitchell's confession had opened a Pandora's box of intelligence operations stretching back decades. Tro's methodical exposure of each revelation transformed not just Burkina Faso, but the entire architecture of international relations. 3 months after Mitchell's arrest, a package arrived at the presidential palace in Ouagadougou. It had no return address, but its contents were explosive: hard drives containing terabytes of CIA operational files, apparently leaked by someone inside the agency who had been horrified by the Burkina Faso operation. Dr. Sawadogo's team spent weeks analyzing the data, cross-referencing it with their own intelligence. What they discovered was staggering. Operation Shifting Sands had targeted not just Burkina Faso, but 16 African nations simultaneously. Each country had been assigned a specific destabilization strategy, ranging from fake inspectors to manufactured ethnic conflicts to deliberate economic sabotage. Tro faced a dilemma. Releasing all the information at once would cause chaos across Africa, potentially triggering the very instability the CIA had sought to create. But keeping it secret would allow the operations to continue. He chose a middle path: selective, strategic disclosure that would neutralize threats while maintaining stability. He began by privately contacting the leaders of the targeted nations, sharing specific intelligence about operations in their countries. President Amara Konate of Mali learned that 3 of his military advisors were CIA assets. President Fatima Sankara of Niger discovered a planned coup scheduled for the following month. President John Mensaha of Ghana was informed that his country's currency crisis had been deliberately engineered. Each leader was given evidence and advice on how to neutralize the threats quietly, without causing public panic. The purge that followed was silent but sweeping. Hundreds of foreign intelligence assets were expelled from Africa. Most departures were explained as routine diplomatic rotations or contract completions, but the economic implications were staggering. The files revealed that currency manipulations alone had cost African nations an estimated $200 billion over the previous decade. Commodity price manipulations had stolen another $150 billion. Engineered conflicts had destroyed infrastructure worth $300 billion. The CIA hadn't just been spying on Africa, it had been systematically impoverishing it. Tro convened a secret summit of affected nations in Ouagadougou. The meetings, held in the same secure facility where he had planned Mitchell's exposure, brought together intelligence chiefs and economic ministers from across the continent. Their decision was unprecedented. They would create a continental counterintelligence and economic defense network. The African Economic Defense Initiative was born. It pooled intelligence resources, shared financial monitoring systems, and created rapid response teams for economic attacks. 6 months later, when currency traders tried to crash the Ghanaian cedi, the network detected the manipulation in real time and coordinated a defense that not only prevented the crash, but cost the attackers $2 billion in losses. But Tro understood that defense alone was not enough. Africa needed to go on the offensive, not militarily, but through what he called aggressive transparency. "If sunlight is the best disinfectant," he said, "then we will shine spotlights on every shadow where exploitation hides." He established the African Transparency Institute, staffed with the continent's best investigators, hackers, and analysts. Their mission was simple: expose every instance of foreign exploitation, economic, political, or social. The Institute's first report, released 6 months after Mitchell's arrest, documented over 1,400 active intelligence operations targeting African nations.
Its impact was seismic.
Stock markets crashed as corporations were revealed to be fronts for intelligence agencies. Diplomatic relations froze as ambassadors were exposed as spy handlers. International organizations faced existential crises as their infiltration became public. The Vatican was particularly embarrassed when the Institute revealed that several Catholic charities in Africa had been used as CIA funding channels. The Pope himself was forced to publicly apologize and implement reforms to prevent future intelligence infiltration of church organizations. The technology sector faced its own reckoning. The Institute exposed that major tech companies had been providing real-time data on African users to Western intelligence agencies. Every email, every message, every search monitored. The revelation triggered what became known as the digital sovereignty movement, with African nations developing their own secure communication platforms. Dr. Sawadogo led this technological revolution, creating Africanet, a quantum-encrypted communication system mathematically impossible to intercept. Within 2 years, it had 500 million users across the continent. Western tech companies, having lost trust through their complicity, saw their African market share collapse. The educational impact was transformative. The exposure revealed that many foreign scholarship programs had been covert recruitment pipelines for intelligence agencies. Thousands of Africa's brightest minds had been funded and turned into assets, often without their knowledge. This revelation triggered a complete restructuring of African education. Countries that had been sending their best students abroad began building world-class universities at home. The brain drain that had weakened Africa for generations reversed as students chose patriotic education over potentially compromised foreign degrees. The International Criminal Court, faced with overwhelming evidence of systematic crimes, opened investigations into what they termed intelligence terrorism. The legal principle was groundbreaking. Using intelligence operations to destabilize nations was as criminal as military invasion. The first conviction came 18 months after Mitchell's arrest. Richard Hammond, former CIA Deputy Director for Operations, was convicted in absentia of crimes against humanity for orchestrating operations that had caused famines, conflicts, and economic collapses across Africa. The conviction was largely symbolic. Hammond would never serve time. But it set a historic precedent. The media landscape was transformed. News organizations that had been assets, or unwitting tools, of intelligence agencies faced bankruptcy as readers abandoned them. New, independent media outlets emerged, committed to verification and transparency. The era of manufacturing consent through media manipulation ended as audiences demanded proof, sources, and independent verification. The cultural impact was equally profound. Artists across Africa created works exploring themes of deception and revelation. The most powerful was a sculpture by Senegalese artist Moussa Dio, a giant eye made of mirrors reflecting viewers while revealing hidden cameras within. Titled "They Watch Us Watching Them," it became an icon of the surveillance age. Films about the Mitchell incident proliferated. Hollywood produced a thriller portraying Mitchell as a misguided patriot. It flopped globally. Nollywood produced a dark comedy showing bumbling CIA agents repeatedly failing to deceive clever Africans. It became the highest-grossing African film of all time. The narrative had shifted. The spies were no longer seen as clever professionals. They were desperate criminals. The psychological impact on Western intelligence agencies was devastating. The assumption of superiority that had underpinned their operations was shattered. Recruitment plummeted as potential agents saw the profession as both immoral and ineffective. Psychologists called it institutional depression, a collective loss of purpose and identity. Several former intelligence officers came forward seeking redemption through truth-telling. Jennifer Thompson, a former CIA analyst, revealed that the agency had wargamed the complete destabilization of Africa, planning to trigger continental collapse to justify recolonization under the guise of humanitarian intervention. The revelation of these war games caused international outrage. The African Union demanded, and received, binding commitments from Western nations that any such plans would be considered acts of war. The principle of anticipatory defense was established, allowing nations to take preemptive action against planned destabilization. Through it all, Traoré's approach remained measured and strategic. He avoided inflammatory rhetoric, focusing instead on building systems that made exploitation impossible. His speeches emphasized cooperation over confrontation, transparency over revenge, and development over destruction. "We do not seek to punish the past," he said in one address. "We seek to prevent future exploitation. We do not want revenge for what was done, but justice in what will be done. We do not aim to isolate ourselves, but to integrate as equals." This approach attracted unexpected allies. Scandinavian nations, embarrassed by their indirect complicity through intelligence-sharing agreements, became Africa's strongest supporters in international forums. Germany, seeking to distance itself from American intelligence operations, provided technology and training for African counterintelligence, even on U.S. soil. The revelations triggered a period of soul-searching. Congressional hearings in Washington exposed the full extent of CIA operations, leading to the most significant intelligence reform since the Church Committee of the 1960s. The American public, learning what had been done in their name, demanded accountability. The economic recovery that followed was nothing short of remarkable. With manipulations ended and resources properly valued, African economies grew at rates that stunned economists. The African miracle, as it came to be known, saw average growth rates of 12% annually for 5 consecutive years. This growth was not just statistical, it was visible. Cities that had stagnated for decades began to flourish. Infrastructure once thought impossible to fund was built with recovered resources. Schools and hospitals that had been dreams became realities. The prosperity that exploitation had long delayed finally arrived. Health improvements were dramatic. With proper funding from reclaimed resources, diseases that had plagued Africa for generations were eradicated. Malaria was eliminated in 12 countries within 5 years. HIV treatment became universal and free. Life expectancy increased by an average of 15 years. Environmental progress was equally striking. Without the pressure to extract resources recklessly to service manipulated debt, sustainable development became possible. Forests once destined for cloth cutting were preserved. Mines that would have poisoned water tables were operated cleanly or shut down entirely. The false choice between development and environmental stewardship was revealed as yet another deception. Technological advancement accelerated beyond all projections. The urgent need to develop secure systems to prevent infiltration had created a generation of experts who surpassed Western capabilities. African quantum computing, encryption, and artificial intelligence began leading global innovation. Even the space program seemed almost surreal. The African Space Agency, funded by recovered resources and free from foreign interference, launched its first satellite within 3 years of Mitchell's arrest. Its primary mission was to monitor resource extraction, ensuring that no exploitation could hide from orbital observation. Diplomatically, the revolution was complete. African nations, once dismissed as junior partners, became essential players in global governance. The UN Security Council was reformed to include permanent African representation. The World Bank and IMF were replaced by new institutions designed to serve, rather than exploit, developing nations. The military implications were profound. With manufactured conflicts and staged threats exposed, military spending could be reduced and redirected toward development. Armies once required to defend against artificial threats became engineering corps, building roads, bridges, and schools. The social cohesion that followed was extraordinary. Ethnic conflicts that had been deliberately inflamed were revealed as intelligence operations. Religious tensions, carefully stoked for decades, were shown to be manufactured. The divisions that had weakened African nations for generations were exposed as foreign manipulations. This revelation triggered reconciliation on a continental scale. Communities that had fought each other for generations discovered their conflicts had been scripted by outsiders. The anger that had once been directed inward was redirected toward those who had orchestrated their suffering. Women played a decisive role in this transformation. Many of the intelligence operatives who had infiltrated Africa had targeted male leaders, assuming patriarchal structures would guarantee control. They ignored or underestimated women, an error that proved fatal to their plans. Women became the backbone of the counterintelligence network. Dr. Aminata Sawadogo became a global icon, proving that mathematical genius had no gender and no geography. Intelligence officers dismissed by chauvinist foreign agencies had gathered crucial intelligence. Women's organizations, long overlooked as irrelevant, became powerful information networks, detecting and exposing operations before they could unfold. The youth response was revolutionary. The generation that came of age during the Mitchell exposure grew up knowing their continent had been deliberately impoverished. They directed their energy not toward immigration but toward reconstruction. Desperation gave way to determination. Universities across Africa reported surging enrollments in intelligence studies, cryptography, international law, and investigative journalism. Career aspirations shifted from working for foreign organizations to protecting against them. The defenders became more numerous than the attackers. The diaspora response was complex but ultimately transformative. Africans abroad, learning of the systematic exploitation, faced difficult choices. Many returned home, bringing skills and resources. Others became advocates in their adopted countries, exposing and opposing exploitation from within. The reparations movement that emerged carried a moral authority that previous efforts had lacked, armed with documented evidence of deliberate impoverishment. The case for compensation was undeniable. The numbers were staggering. Trillions of dollars stolen through decades of manipulation. While full reparations remained politically impossible, partial compensation began to flow. Corporations exposed as intelligence fronts paid settlements. Governments implicated in operations provided aid without conditions. Technology companies complicit in surveillance transferred patents and expertise.
The religious implications were profound.
The exposure that many missionary organizations had been intelligence covers triggered a crisis in Western churches.
Congregations demanded accountability.
Denominations split over complicity. The credibility of Western Christianity in Africa was shattered. But from this destruction came reconstruction. African Christianity, freed from foreign influence, developed its own theology, its own practices, its own identity. The faith that had once been used as a tool of control became a source of liberation.
Churches once infiltrated were purified.
Islamic organizations faced similar reckonings. The revelation that some Islamic charities had been Western intelligence fronts caused outrage in the Muslim world. The cleanup that followed strengthened legitimate institutions and exposed fake ones. Traditional African religions, long suppressed by both Christianity and Islam, experienced a revival. The exposure that foreign religions had been used as tools of exploitation gave traditional practices new legitimacy. The spiritual colonization that had accompanied physical colonization began to reverse. Scientific advancement accelerated at a breathtaking pace. With brain drain reversed and funding restored, African scientists delivered breakthrough after breakthrough. The cure for sickle cell anemia came from a lab in Lagos.
Drought-resistant crops emerged from research in Nairobi.
Battery technology that revolutionized energy storage was developed in Cairo. These innovations were not just for Africa, they transformed the world. The crops helped farmers in Australia. The medical treatments saved lives worldwide. The new energy storage enabled renewable revolutions on every continent. Crucially, Africa now owned the intellectual property. Instead of foreign patents siphoning value away, African patents generated income from global usage. The flow of intellectual property reversed. For the first time in modern history, value streamed from Africa to the world.
The artistic explosion continued.
Films, music, literature, and visual arts, freed from foreign gatekeeping, found global audiences. African stories, told by African voices, reshaped global culture. African fashion set worldwide trends.
African cuisine became internationally celebrated.
African philosophy entered academic discourse. The continent once portrayed as culturally backward became recognized as culturally essential. Linguistic revival accompanied this cultural transformation. African languages, long suppressed in favor of colonial tongues, experienced a renaissance.
Technology made preservation and teaching easier. Children once taught to be ashamed of their languages became proud speakers.
Most importantly, the success of counterintelligence created new vocabulary. Words from African languages entered global usage to describe concepts of resistance, exposure, and sovereignty. The linguistic colonization that had accompanied physical colonization began to reverse. As the 10th anniversary of Mitchell's arrest approached, the transformation was complete, but never static. Africa had changed from victim to victor, from exploited to empowered, from manipulated to sovereign. Yet vigilance remained constant, for exploitation would always seek new forms. Tro, now an elder statesman more than an active president, reflected on the decades since that humid Tuesday morning when Mitchell had walked into his office. The fake inspector triggered real transformation, he said in his anniversary address. Their deception led to our revelation. Their attack became our advantage. They thought they were clever, sending a lie dressed as truth.
But every deception carries the seeds of its own exposure.
Every lie reveals truth by what it tries to hide. Mitchell came to trap us, but trapped himself and the system that sent him. This is not just about one operation, one agency, or one country. It is about a principle. Sovereignty requires eternal vigilance.
Freedom demands constant defense. Independence is not granted, it is taken and held. We knew he was coming. We knew he was fake. We knew his mission.
We knew because we had become what they never expected: capable, intelligent, prepared.
The surprise was not that they tried to deceive us.
The surprise was that we were ready. The fake UN inspector had walked into that office believing he was writing another chapter of successful exploitation. Instead, he wrote the final chapter of intelligence imperialism. The trap he thought he was setting became the trap that caught him, and the entire system of deception he represented. The world watched as a small African nation exposed and defeated one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations ever attempted. Their implications went far beyond Burkina Faso, beyond Africa, beyond intelligence itself. It was proof that the powerless could defeat the powerful, that truth could overcome deception, that transparency could triumph over conspiracy. Mitchell, still serving his sentence in Burkina Faso, had become a different man. Arrogance had given way to reflection.
Certainty had been replaced by questioning.
The spy had become a student of the sovereignty he had once tried to violate. In his final interview before his scheduled release, Mitchell said something remarkable.
"I came to Burkina Faso as a weapon. I leave as a warning.
A warning that the age of deception is ending. A warning that sovereignty is stronger than subterfuge. A warning that President Traoré represents not just one leader, but a new reality, a world where the hunters have become the hunted."
The transformation was complete.
The fake inspector had become living evidence of change.
Deception had turned into detection.
The operation had become opportunity. And Traoré, who had known all along, had turned knowledge into power, power into exposure, and exposure into transformation. A transformation that changed not just Burkina Faso, but the entire architecture of global relations. The man who had walked into that office with fake credentials and real poison had triggered an antidote that immunized not just one nation, but potentially all nations, against the disease of deception. The inspector who never was had inspected nothing, but had been inspected completely.
The trap he carried had trapped him. The deception he planned had deceived only himself. Traoré had known all along.
That knowledge, patient, prepared, and perfectly executed, had changed everything. The fake UN inspector had become the most real thing that ever happened to international intelligence, exposing its methods, revealing its purposes, and ultimately destroying its ability to operate with impunity. The story that had begun with an intercepted communication had become a communication to the world. Sovereignty is not negotiable.
Deception is not undetectable.
Even the most powerful agencies can be defeated by preparation, patience, and the perfect execution of a counter-operation that turns their own methods against them. The revelations did not end with Mitchell's conviction and imprisonment. In the following years, evidence surfaced of a conspiracy so vast that even Traoré had underestimated its scope. The fake UN inspector had been merely the visible tip of an iceberg that extended deep into the frozen waters of international deception. 6 months after the 10th anniversary, a second whistleblower emerged from within the CIA. Unlike the first anonymous source who had provided the hard drives, this one came forward publicly. Marcus Webb, a 20-year veteran of the agency's Africa division, held a press conference in Geneva under Swiss protection. There, he revealed that Mitchell's operation had been part of something called the Continental Reset Initiative. The initiative's goal was breathtaking in its ambition: to systematically destabilize every independent-minded African government within a 5-year period, creating enough chaos to justify a humanitarian intervention that would effectively recolonize the continent under the guise of international administration. Mitchell's mission, to plant chemical weapons evidence, had been designed as the first domino that would topple the rest. Webb provided documentation showing that similar operations had been planned for Algeria, Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Angola. Each nation had been assigned its vulnerabilities: ethnic tensions in Ethiopia, religious divisions in Tanzania, economic pressure in Angola, political fractures in Algeria. Burkina Faso had been chosen for the chemical weapons gambit because it would provide the most dramatic justification for intervention. The documents revealed that the operation involved not only the CIA but a consortium of Western intelligence agencies, multinational corporations, and even some international NGOs that had been co-opted or created outright for this purpose. The budget was staggering: $12 billion, hidden across black budgets and corporate contributions.
Traoré's response to these revelations was measured but decisive. He convened an emergency meeting of the African Union and presented the evidence to all 54 member states. The response was unanimous. Africa would create its own continental defense initiative, not military, but intelligence-based, to detect and prevent any future attempts at coordinated destabilization. Headquartered in Addis Ababa, with major centers in Cairo, Lagos, and Johannesburg, the initiative brought together the best minds on the continent. Dr. Sawadgo was appointed as its first technical director, overseeing a team of mathematicians, computer scientists, and analysts tasked with monitoring global communications for signs of hostile operations. Within its first year, the initiative exposed 16 active operations targeting African countries. A planned coup in Gabon was prevented after unusual financial transfers to military officers were detected. An attempted assassination in Mozambique was foiled when encrypted communications were decoded. Economic manipulation targeting the Kenyan shilling was stopped after its pattern was recognized from previous attacks. But the initiative went further. It began investigating historical operations, uncovering decades of manipulation that had been hidden from public view. The archives they compiled became known as the Books of Revelation, documenting every known instance of foreign interference in African affairs since independence. The Books of Revelation showed that nearly every major post-colonial conflict had been either instigated or exacerbated by foreign intelligence operations. The Biafran War, the Rwandan genocide, the Congo Wars, all bore the fingerprints of external manipulation. The documentation was so extensive that a new building had to be constructed just to house the physical evidence. The legal implications were staggering. Lawyers argued that if conflicts had been deliberately instigated, then the instigators bore legal responsibility for the resulting atrocities. Class action lawsuits were filed on behalf of victims against intelligence agencies and the governments that had directed them. While often symbolic, many defendants would never pay. These cases established precedent, shifting the moral and legal landscape of international law. The technological arms race that emerged from the Mitchell incident accelerated rapidly. African nations developed ever more sophisticated detection capabilities, while foreign agencies refined their deception methods. But the advantage had shifted. Defense is easier than offense in intelligence, and Africa now knew what to look for. Dr. Sadugo's team achieved a breakthrough that changed everything. They developed an algorithm capable of detecting patterns of deception hidden in seemingly normal communications. Trained on thousands of exposed intelligence messages, the algorithm identified operational language with 94% accuracy. Its first major success came when it detected an operation targeting South Africa's power grid. What appeared to be routine maintenance communications between utility companies was actually coordination for a cyber attack that would have plunged the country into darkness. The attack was prevented, and the perpetrators, a mix of state and non-state actors, were exposed. The economic impact of the initiative was enormous. With manipulation detected and prevented, African currencies stabilized. Coup attempts were stopped before execution. Political risk fell. Growth became sustainable. The $2 billion annual cost of the initiative was repaid many times over and losses avoided. International investors, once skeptical, began to see Africa as more stable than many developed regions. Paradoxically, the continent once considered vulnerable became safer for investment than nations still open to manipulation. The educational revolution continued. The Institute for Sovereignty Studies was established in Ouagadougou, on the very site where Mitchell had been tried. It became a global center for the study of resistance to exploitation. Students from every continent came to learn how Burkina Faso had defeated the CIA, how Africa had achieved intelligence independence, and how developing nations could protect themselves. The curriculum was comprehensive: cryptography, psychology of deception, economic warfare, media manipulation, legal frameworks for sovereignty, and the history of intelligence operations. But the most important course was called Thinking Like True, a study in how to anticipate, prepare for, and counter sophisticated deception. True himself occasionally lectured at the Institute. His most popular lecture was titled The Power of Knowing, in which he taught that knowledge, properly understood and applied, could defeat any deception. When I knew Mitchell was coming, he told students, I had choices. I could have refused him entry, but that would only have delayed another attempt. I could have arrested him immediately, but that would have limited the exposure. I chose to let him proceed because I knew that his confidence would be his weakness. The more he believed he was succeeding, the more evidence he would create of his own crimes. The cultural impact of the Mitchell incident continued to deepen. It became a touchstone for global discussions about truth, deception, and sovereignty. Children played games in which they tried to spot fake inspectors among their friends.
Universities held competitions where students created and detected deception scenarios. The skills of counterintelligence had become democratized, and Africa, once the most surveilled continent, had become the world's most watchful guardian. Artists continued to explore themes from the incident. One of the most powerful pieces was an installation by Burkina Faso artist Joan Baptiste Kabor, a room full of mirrors where visitors gradually realized that some of the mirrors were actually windows, behind which actors portraying intelligence officers were taking notes. The discomfort visitors felt upon this discovery was precisely the point. Surveillance was everywhere, but so too was the ability to detect it. The film industry also contributed to the conversation, producing increasingly sophisticated works about the incident. A documentary series, The Inspector Files, interviewed everyone involved, from Traoré to Mitchell to the real Dr. Harrison. The series won numerous awards, but its greater achievement was educating millions about how intelligence operations actually worked. Mitchell himself, as his release date approached, had become an unexpected advocate for transparency. His book, written from prison and titled The Spy Who Got Caught, was brutally honest about CIA methods and mentality. He donated all proceeds to victims of intelligence operations, though he admitted that no amount of money could undo the damage. In the book, Mitchell revealed details that had not surfaced during the trial. The CIA had considered multiple approaches to Burkina Faso, including assassination, coup, and economic collapse. The fake inspector plan had been chosen because it seemed the cleanest and least likely to be traced back to the United States. The irony that it became the most thoroughly exposed operation in CIA history was not lost on him. He also revealed the psychological profile the CIA had created of Traoré, a profile that, in retrospect, was embarrassingly wrong. They had assessed him as intelligent but naive, idealistic but inexperienced, and vulnerable to sophisticated deception. The profile, Mitchell admitted, had been based on racist assumptions about African leaders rather than any meaningful intelligence about Traoré himself. The real Dr. Michael Harrison, whose identity Mitchell had stolen, became a vocal advocate for reforming international inspection systems. Working with the UN, he helped create new protocols that made impersonation virtually impossible. Inspectors now carried biometric identification, real-time verification systems, and multiple forms of authentication. The days of fake inspectors were over. The UN itself underwent significant reforms in the aftermath. The organization that had once been infiltrated and impersonated now implemented the strictest security measures of any international body. More importantly, it redefined its relationship with intelligence agencies, building firewalls between legitimate international oversight and covert national operations. The economic philosophy that emerged from the Mitchell incident was revolutionary. Traditional development economics had long assumed that developing nations required Western guidance and investment. The incident proved otherwise. What they actually needed was protection from Western manipulation. This new philosophy, called defensive development, prioritized sovereignty and security as prerequisites for prosperity. The results were remarkable. Countries that had struggled for decades suddenly flourished once external manipulation ceased. Resources that had been extracted or diverted to defend against manufactured crises could now be invested in genuine development. Growth rates soared, proving that much of Africa's poverty had been imposed, not inevitable. The environmental effects were equally dramatic. Freed from the pressure of manufactured conflicts and forced debt repayments, nations could invest in conservation and adopt sustainable practices. What had once seemed impossible under constant exploitation became inevitable under sovereignty. Public health also improved. Diseases that had lingered due to disrupted healthcare systems were finally eradicated. Mental health indicators rose as entire populations were no longer forced to live under constant threat of artificial crises. The long psychological trauma of continuous manipulation began to heal. Scholars began to study the crucial role of traditional knowledge in defeating modern intelligence operations. African societies had developed sophisticated methods of detecting deception over centuries. When combined with modern technology, these traditional techniques proved more effective than either alone. Elders who had once been dismissed as relics became valuable advisors. Their understanding of human nature, cultivated through generations of oral tradition, proved vital in counterintelligence. The gender dynamics of the transformation were equally significant. Women, long excluded from formal intelligence services, became central to the new counterintelligence model. Their social networks, once dismissed as mere gossip, were revealed to be powerful information systems capable of detecting anomalies that male officers often missed. Dr. Sawadogo became a global icon, celebrated not just for her mathematical brilliance but for her intelligence philosophy, one that emphasized cooperation over competition, transparency over secrecy, and collective security over individual advantage. Her methods, initially dismissed as feminine and therefore weak, proved far more effective than traditional approaches. The youth movement that arose from the Mitchell incident transformed African politics. Young people who had grown up understanding that their poverty was manufactured, their conflicts scripted, and their dependency imposed began demanding a different kind of leadership. The old guard, those who had collaborated with or tolerated exploitation, were swept aside by a generation that placed sovereignty above all else. Student movements across the continent adopted the slogan, "We know you're watching." It was both a recognition of surveillance and a declaration of defiance. They organized through secure communications, verified information independently, and exposed manipulation attempts in real time. The African diaspora's role also evolved. Those living abroad, now aware of the systematic nature of exploitation, became intelligence assets for their home countries. They reported on planned operations, provided early warnings of economic attacks, and leveraged their positions within Western institutions to gather information. This reversal, African intelligence gathering on Western powers, rather than the other way around, created a seismic shift in the global intelligence balance. Western agencies now found themselves infiltrated by African assets, men and women who were not motivated by money or coercion, but by patriotism and a sense of justice. Religious institutions also underwent transformation. The exposure that many churches and mosques had been used as intelligence fronts forced sweeping reforms. Religious organizations verified foreign funding sources, implemented transparency measures, and expelled compromised leaders. Traditional African spirituality, which had always emphasized detecting hidden threats, regained its respect and became an essential part of the continent's defense philosophy. The methods once used to identify evil spirits proved remarkably effective in identifying intelligence operatives. The spiritual and the practical merged in ways that strengthened both. As Mitchell's release date approached, fierce debate erupted over his fate. Some argued he should be expelled immediately, his debt to Burkina Faso paid. Others insisted he remain imprisoned indefinitely, a permanent symbol of justice served. But True had a different idea. He proposed that Mitchell, if willing, stay in Burkina Faso, not as a prisoner, but as a teacher at the Institute for Sovereignty Studies. Not to teach deception, but detection. His insider knowledge of CIA methodology, True argued, would be invaluable in training the next generation of counterintelligence officers. Mitchell accepted without hesitation. He understood this was his chance at redemption, an opportunity to undo some of the harm he had caused. His course, Inside the CIA Mind, quickly became one of the Institute's most popular offerings. The irony was impossible to ignore. The spy who had once come to destroy Burkina Faso's sovereignty was now one of its most effective defenders. The operative who had tried to plant evidence was now teaching others how to uncover it. The man who had embodied exploitation had become an educator against it. The global impact of the Mitchell incident continued to expand. Latin American countries began implementing African-developed counterintelligence techniques. Asian nations adopted the model of the Continental Defense Initiative. Even some European countries, realizing they too had been subject to manipulation by supposed allies, started building their own sovereignty protection frameworks. The New World Order that emerged was neither unipolar nor bipolar, but multipolar in the truest sense. Every nation developed its own intelligence capabilities, its own defenses, its own sovereignty strategies. The age of intelligence imperialism had ended. In its place arose an intelligence equilibrium. The economic implications were profound. With the covert ability to manipulate markets removed, real competition could finally thrive. Without the option to destabilize governments for economic gain, nations were forced to cooperate rather than coerce. Without the shadow of exploitation through deception, fair trade became the only trade. Technological progress accelerated. The quantum encryption systems developed by Dr. Sawadogo's team became the global standard. The pattern detection algorithms, first designed to uncover covert operations, found uses in everything from medical diagnostics to climate modeling. The defensive technologies that had been born to protect sovereignty became the very engines of development. By the 15th anniversary of Mitchell's arrest, the transformation was complete, yet ongoing. Africa had gone from being the world's most manipulated continent to its most manipulation-resistant. The expertise that necessity had forced it to develop became an exportable excellence, shared globally. At the anniversary commemoration, True, now in the twilight of his public career, delivered what many considered the defining speech of his life. ***, 15 years ago, a man walked into my office pretending to be something he was not, planning to commit a crime, confident he would succeed. He failed, not because we were lucky, but because we were prepared. He was exposed, not because he made mistakes, but because we made none. The lesson of the fake inspector is not just about one operation or one man. It is about the power of truth over deception, preparation over improvisation, knowledge over ignorance. They believed technological superiority guaranteed success. We proved that human intelligence, properly applied, could defeat any technology. But the greatest lesson is this: sovereignty is not granted by international law, nor protected by military might. Sovereignty is taken through vigilance, maintained through intelligence, and strengthened through transparency. The fake inspector taught us that sovereignty is not a status, but a practice, not a right, but a responsibility. To those who still attempt to deceive us, I say, we are watching. To those who still try to manipulate us, I say, we are ready. To those who still seek to exploit us, I say, we know. And knowledge, as Mitchell learned, is the ultimate power.
The speech earned a standing ovation, not just from the audience in Ouagadougou, but from viewing parties across the world. The fake UN inspector incident had become more than history. It had become mythology, a modern David and Goliath story. But unlike mythology, this one was documented, verified, and irrefutable, and indisputable. Every frame of video, every page of documentation, every piece of evidence had been preserved. The Mitchell Archive, as it came to be known, contained over 50 terabytes of data, freely available to researchers, journalists, and citizens worldwide. The archive served multiple purposes.
It was evidence of what had been attempted, education in how to detect such attempts, insurance against future attempts, and inspiration for those facing similar exploitation. Students of international relations studied the incident as a turning point in global power dynamics, the moment when Mitchell entered TrueS office, now seen as the high-water mark of intelligence imperialism.
His arrest marked the beginning of its decline. His conviction signaled its end. The generation that came of age after the Mitchell incident thought differently about everything. They assumed surveillance, but were no longer paralyzed by it.
They expected deception, but refused to be fooled by it. They anticipated manipulation, but would not be controlled by it. They had been inoculated against the diseases of exploitation. 15 years later, the economic data was irrefutable. African GDP had increased by 400%.
Poverty had decreased by 60%. Literacy had reached 95%.
Life expectancy had risen by 20 years. The development that had been promised for decades, but prevented through manipulation, had finally arrived. But the true measure of success wasn't economic, it was psychological. The mental chains of colonialism, reinforced by decades of neo-colonial manipulation, had finally been broken. The assumption of inferiority had been replaced by confidence in capability. The passive acceptance of exploitation had become a fierce insistence on equity. The story that had begun with a fake UN inspector had become a story of real transformation. The man who had entered TrueS office carrying deception had triggered detection that changed the world. The operation designed to begin Africa's recolonization had instead secured its permanent independence. Mitchell himself, now a teacher at the Institute for Sovereignty Studies, had become one of the most powerful global advocates for transparency and sovereignty. His transformation from spy to teacher represented something larger, the possibility of redemption through truth. In his final lecture before retirement, Mitchell delivered the words that came to define the entire incident. "I came to Burkina Faso as an arrow, shot by an empire that believed itself invincible, but President True caught that arrow in flight," Mitchell said, "and turned it into a mirror, showing the empire its own ugliness. I was meant to be a weapon of deception. I became proof that deception could be defeated. The fake inspector I pretended to be exposed the real corruption of the system that sent me." The economic implications of what became known as the Mitchell incident were staggering. Economists calculated that had Operation Sandstorm succeeded, Africa would have lost approximately $5 trillion in resources, development, and human potential over the following decades. The planted chemical weapons would have justified interventions that reset African development by generations. Instead, Africa gained those trillions, and more.
Its resources remained under sovereign control.
Its development proceeded without interference. Its human potential flourished without suppression. The continent that had been targeted for recolonization had instead achieved permanent independence. The Mitchell Doctrine, now codified in international law, declared that any attempt to plant evidence for political purposes constituted a crime against humanity. Since its adoption, the doctrine had been invoked successfully to prevent 16 similar operations worldwide. What President Traoré had declared in that courtroom in Ouagadougou had become global jurisprudence. Reflecting on her role, Dr. Soadou, architect of the detection algorithm, said, "Mathematics is universal. Deception, no matter how sophisticated, creates patterns. Those patterns can be detected, analyzed, and exposed.
What we did wasn't magical. It was mathematical.
We applied rigorous analysis to intelligence the same way we would to any dataset." The Continental Defense Initiative she had helped create became the model for regional security worldwide, not military security, but intelligence security, the ability to detect, document, and defeat deception before it could cause harm. The defensive capabilities born of necessity became offensive tools for truth. As the sun set on the 15th anniversary of Mitchell's arrest, President Traoré stood once more in the room where it had all begun. The office had been preserved exactly as it was that humid Tuesday morning, every detail unchanged, a living monument to vigilance.
They thought they were ending our story, Traoré told the gathered dignitaries. Instead, they were beginning it. They thought they were writing our future. Instead, we seized the pen. The man who walked through that door believed he was making history. He was right, just not the history he intended. The transformation was complete, permanent, and still expanding. Every nation that learned from Burkina Faso's example became stronger. Every operation exposed made future operations harder. Every victory for sovereignty was a defeat for exploitation. The fake UN inspector had failed in his mission, but had succeeded in something greater. He had proven that even the most powerful intelligence agencies could be defeated by preparation, patience, and the perfect execution of truth over deception. Traoré had known all along.
And that knowledge had changed not just the outcome of one operation but the entire architecture of global power. The story ended where it began, but everything had changed. The office was the same, but the world outside was transformed. The fake inspector was gone, but the real inspection of global exploitation continued. Traoré, who had known all along, had proven that knowledge properly applied is the most powerful weapon of all, more powerful than armies, more powerful than wealth, more powerful than deception itself. The fake UN inspector had walked into a trap that caught not just him, but the entire system of exploitation he represented. And that trap, carefully set and perfectly sprung, had freed not just Burkina Faso, but every nation willing to learn from its example. Sovereignty that had once seemed impossible was now inevitable.
Dignity that had been denied was now demanded.
The future that had been stolen had been reclaimed. And it had all begun with President Traoré knowing, before anyone else, that the man walking into his office was not who he claimed to be.